Welcome back to Decode Healthcare with Harshal. I'm absolutely thrilled to have you with us for another deep dive into the rules that actually govern our profession. So, in part 30, we untangled the incredibly dense, kind of tricky rules surrounding complications of care. If you haven't watched that explainer yet, definitely go back and check it out. It really lays down some foundational logic that we're going to use all the time. But today we've got a brand new mission. We're cracking open the FY 2026 ICD-10-CM official guidelines, specifically section IB-17, and we're talking entirely about borderline diagnoses. I really want you to think about this for a second. What happens when a diagnosis is resting right on the edge of certainty? You know the situation. You're reading through a patient's chart, and the provider hasn't fully committed to it being a severe, full-blown condition, but they haven't exactly ruled it out either. They just write borderline. Well, the stakes here are actually incredibly high. Code it wrong and you're risking compliance audits, denied claims, and you're frankly compromising the entire patient's medical record. So our mission today is to learn exactly how to legally code these conditions that rest on the edge of clinical certainty without breaking a single compliance rule. But hey, before we dive into the rules themselves, we really need to establish the hierarchy of authority here. When you're first learning medical coding, it's super common to rely heavily on textbooks, right? Like Buck's Step by Step. And textbooks are fantastic for learning the basics and the general rules. However, I need to make this fiercely clear right off the bat. The FY 2026 CMS official guidelines strictly override any textbook generalizations. Literally, they trump everything. Textbooks tend to generalize rules for the sake of simplicity, but out here in the real world of compliance, the CMS guidelines are absolute law. So for this explainer, CMS is our ultimate authority, period. All right, moving right along to Rule 1, borderline equals confirmed. Let's take a look at our very first law. Now, this section completely debunks a massive myth in the medical coding community. So many newer coders just automatically assume that the word borderline inherently means uncertain. But we have to draw a really hard line here. On one side, we've got standard uncertain terms, things like probable or suspected. And as we know from other guidelines, we handle those very, very carefully, depending on if the patient is inpatient or outpatient. But on the flip side, when a provider specifically writes the word borderline at the time of discharge, the code book treats it as an absolute confirmed fact. Seriously, it's not a guess, it's treated as a definitive diagnostic statement. And, don't just take my word for it. Let's read the exact mandate directly from the CMS guidelines. Section IB-17 actually says, if the provider documents a borderline diagnosis at the time of discharge, the diagnosis is coded as confirmed. Just let that sink in for a second. I'm saying that with a lot of enthusiastic authority because it's genuinely one of the most definitive statements in the guidelines. It literally removes all the guesswork. If the doctor writes borderline at discharge, you drop the hammer and code it as confirmed. Absolutely crucial to remember. Okay, let's bring this rule to life with a quick real-world example. Imagine you're reviewing a discharge summary and the provider documents borderline osteopenia. So, how do you code that? Well, you're going to go to your alphabetic index and look up the main term, osteopenia. Then you scan down the list looking for a subterm that says borderline. But guess what? You won't find one. And because it lacks a dedicated subterm in the index, our rule kicks in and dictates that it absolutely must be coded as standard confirmed osteopenia. You don't downcode it to a symptom, and you definitely don't just ignore it. It becomes confirmed osteopenia. Boom, done. Which brings us to Rule 2, classification, exceptions, and care settings. Let's get right into it. So, we've established the baseline mandate, right? But you always have to be on the lookout for how the classification system handles exceptions. The CMS guidelines basically state that borderline is confirmed unless the classification provides a specific entry. I went ahead and turned that kind of dense guideline exception into this punchy, easy-to-memorize 1-2-3 checklist for your daily workflow. Step 1. Always check the alphabetic index for the borderline subterm under your main condition. Step 2. If that subterm actually exists, you must follow that unique path. And step 3. If the subterm is missing, only then do you default to coding it as the confirmed main condition. Sticking to this checklist is going to keep you perfectly compliant every single time. Let's say the documentation says borderline diabetes. This is a perfect illustration of exactly how step 2 works. You open up the index, you go straight to diabetes, and right there underneath it, you're going to see a specific subterm for borderline. The index will light up a unique alphanumeric path for you to follow, which usually directs you to a code for elevated blood glucose or a specific abnormal finding, rather than full-blown diabetes mellitus. Another really great example is borderline personality disorder, which actually has its own specific F code. The bottom line is, If the index gives you a specific tool for the borderline variant, you are legally required to use it. No exceptions. Okay, now we really need to smash a very pervasive myth regarding care settings. If you read the textbooks, you learn that in the outpatient setting, you cannot code uncertain diagnoses like probable or suspected. You're supposed to code the symptoms instead. And because of this, a ton of coders incorrectly assume that they can't code borderline conditions in the outpatient setting either. But check out the exact FY 2026 CMS text. Since borderline conditions are not uncertain diagnoses, no distinction is made between the care setting. Wow. What's just wonderfully simple about this rule is the workflow formula. Inpatient setting equals outpatient setting. Because borderline is treated as a confirmed fact, the rule applies universally across both care environments. Honestly, whether you're coding a massive 3-week hospital inpatient admission or just a quick 15-minute outpatient clinic visit, if the provider writes borderline, you follow the exact same borderline rules, the whole shebang. You don't have to change your logic based on the physical building the patient happens to be sitting in. How great is that? All right, let's dive right into Rule 3, the query safety trigger. So we have the rules down perfectly now, but what happens when the provider's documentation is just an absolute mess? I mean, we've all seen those charts, right? Well, that brings us to the query safety trigger. This is the mandatory action you have to take to issue a clear, non-leading provider query when the clinical documentation is genuinely ambiguous. The guideline explicitly states, whenever the documentation is unclear regarding a borderline condition, coders are encouraged to query for clarification. If you're reading a discharge summary and it's literally impossible to tell if the provider is declaring an active borderline state or if it's just some casual passing note that got copy-pasted from 3 years ago, guessing is strictly prohibited. You absolutely cannot guess your way to compliance. To help you handle those messy situations, I've outlined the exact workflow a coder must follow to resolve those confusing progress notes. First step, stop and do not guess. Seriously. Second, check the context of the entire chart for ambiguity. Ask yourself, does the final discharge note actually match the lab reports and the daily progress notes? Third, if things do not align, issue a clear, non-leading provider query. Just ask the doctor to clarify the exact status of the diagnosis. And finally, once the provider actually answers, you can cleanly validate the diagnostic entry. This workflow right here, this is exactly what separates basic data entry clerks from true professional medical coders. Wow, we have covered a massive amount of crucial ground today. I really hope this explainer has completely clarified how you need to navigate Section IB17. If you found this breakdown helpful and it finally made these guidelines click for you, please make sure to subscribe, hit that like button, and share this explainer with your fellow healthcare students and coding colleagues. But before I let you go, I want to leave you with a provocative question to chew on. Are unspecified codes always an error? Think about that one carefully. Next time, in Part 32, we're tackling Section IB18, where we are going to completely explode the myth surrounding unspecified codes and discover exactly when they are actually the highest form of compliance. For sure, you will not want to miss it. See you then.